2 days ago, inside a roaring stadium in Niamey, a general stepped forward and said the unthinkable. Not, "We are preparing," not, "We are concerned." He said, "We are going to war with France." The crowd exploded, thousands chanting, phones raised, anti-French slogans echoing through the capital of Niger. Within hours, the clip was everywhere, across Africa, across Europe, inside government offices in Paris. Analysts froze the frame. Diplomats rewound the audio. Because when a military leader publicly declares war on a former colonial power, that's not rhetoric. That's escalation. Paris responded quickly. Officials dismissed it as information warfare. They insisted there was no question of intervention. But notice the wording carefully. Not never, just not now. And in geopolitics, words like that matter. This crisis did not start in a stadium. It didn't start with a speech. It started underground, beneath the sands of the Sahel, where one of the most valuable resources on Earth has been pulled from Niger's soil for more than half a century. Since 1971, French nuclear giant Uranium, formerly Arriva, mined uranium in Niger. That uranium fueled France's nuclear reactors. It powered homes in Paris. It helped make France one of the most energy-independent nations in Europe. Today, France generates roughly 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, the highest share in the world. And for decades, a large portion of that fuel came from one place. At its peak, Niger supplied between 30 and 40% of France's uranium needs. Now pause there. A country where nearly 80% of the population lacks reliable electricity was exporting the very material that kept French cities glowing at night. That contrast is not just economic, it's emotional, political, historical, and it sits at the heart of this confrontation. For decades, Orano operated major uranium sites in the Arlit region. At the Somaire mine, Orano held 63% ownership. Niger's state company held 37%. France controlled decisions. France controlled profit. Then came 2021. One major mine shut down. But what it left behind wasn't just abandoned infrastructure. Locals reported radioactive waste, contaminated water, rising cancer cases, dust storms carrying radioactive particles across neighborhoods. French researchers later confirmed serious water contamination concerns. For many Nigerians, uranium meant something very different than prosperity. It meant extraction without transformation. July 2023, a military coup overthrew President Mohamed Bazoum. In his place rose General Abdourahmane Tiani and the National Council for the Safeguarding of the Homeland, and their message was unmistakable. The relationship with France was over. Within months, more than 1,500 French troops stationed in Niger were expelled. By December 2023, they were gone. 50 years of military presence erased. In June 2024, Niger revoked Orano's license for the massive Imuraran uranium deposit, one of the largest undeveloped reserves in the world. France had invested years planning for it. Cancelled. Then in December 2024, Niger moved against the Somaire mine. On paper, Orano still owned 63%, but on the ground, Niger took control, changed the lock, began running operations. Orano filed arbitration cases at the World Bank's dispute settlement body. Niger ignored them. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a rupture. Roughly 1,000 tons of uranium, worth an estimated $270 million, stockpiled in warehouses. France said it belonged to them. Niger said it came from their soil, and they intended to sell it. This is where tension stops being symbolic. Because when $270 million worth of strategic nuclear fuel, legal and geopolitical crossfire, things can move very fast. And soon they did. In September 2025, an arbitration tribunal under the World Bank's International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes issued a clear provisional order. Niger was forbidden from selling, transferring, or facilitating the transfer of the uranium stockpile until the ownership dispute was resolved. In simple terms, freeze it. Don't touch it. It was meant to pause the crisis. Because in late November, reports began surfacing that convoys were moving out of the Somaire site under military escort. Trucks, guarded routes, uranium leaving storage. Orano said they learned about it through media reports. They were furious. They called it illegal. They warned that transporting uranium through unsecured corridors posed severe safety and proliferation risks. They threatened criminal proceedings. But on the ground, the material was already gone. At that moment, this stopped being a contractual disagreement. It became open defiance of an international legal order, because once a state ignores a World Bank tribunal, once it physically moves disputed nuclear material. The dispute shifts from boardrooms to power politics. Then, Niger's leader, General Abdourahmane Tiani, went on national television. His message was blunt. Niger has the sovereign right to dispose of its natural resources, to sell them to whoever it chooses, in complete independence. That was not just economic policy. Paris understood the signal. But Niger wasn't done escalating. On February 4th, 2026, Justice Minister Alio Daouda held a press conference that injected a new element into the crisis. Inspectors, he claimed, had discovered 400 barrels of radioactive core material near Arlit, in the same region where French companies operated for decades. Radiation levels, he said, were between 7 and 10 microsieverts per hour. Background levels should be around 0.5, 14 to 20 times higher than normal. 2 chemical compounds linked to respiratory illness were reportedly detected. The accusation was explosive. Decades of environmental disregard, public health violations, radioactive dumping. Orano denied it outright, stating they never operated at the specific site mentioned. Now, the conflict wasn't just about ownership. It was about responsibility for 50 years of extraction, for rising cancer claims, for water systems locals say were compromised. And when resource disputes evolve into public health allegations, the political stakes multiply. Because now it's not just profit versus sovereignty. It's morality versus legacy. France faced a separate calculation. President Emmanuel Macron is heading toward a 2027 election. Appear weak internationally, especially in a former colony, and political rivals will weaponize it instantly. If Niger sells $270 million worth of uranium to countries like Russia, Turkey, or Iran, and Paris does nothing, critics will ask one question: who controls French strategic interests? Because uranium is not just another commodity. It fuels nuclear reactors. It underpins energy security. It ties directly into France's national identity as a nuclear power. France has historically acted. In 2011, Paris played a key role in NATO's intervention in Libya that toppled Muammar Gaddafi. That same year, French helicopters struck forces loyal to Laurent Gbagbo in Côte d'Ivoire during a post-election crisis. French troops operated for nearly a decade under Operation Barkhane before eventually withdrawing. From Niger's perspective, this pattern matters. When Paris sees strategic interests at risk in former colonies, has acted before. So when General Amadou Bachiru Ibro stood in that stadium and declared, "We are going to war with France," it wasn't random theater. It was built on historical memory. And here's where the numbers come in. France fields roughly 264,000 active military personnel, a $50+ billion defense budget, nuclear weapons, an aircraft carrier, submarines, around 200+ combat aircraft. Niger, about 10,000 troops, fewer than 30 aircraft, many aging, no navy, no submarines, no strategic airlift. On paper, it's not a contest, but wars are not fought on spreadsheets. They are fought in terrain and in alliances. And that's where the equation changes completely, because Niger is no longer standing alone. On September 16th, 2023, General Abdourahmane Tiani signed a security pact that quietly reshaped the balance of power in the Sahel. It was called the Alliance of Sahel States, a new bloc between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. 3 military-led governments. 3 nations that had all expelled French forces. 3 regimes openly rejecting Western influence. An attack on one member's sovereignty would be considered an attack on all. That single sentence changes everything. Because now, if France were to strike Niger, even in a limited operation, it would not be dealing with 10,000 Nigerian troops. It would be confronting a regional bloc. Together, the 3 countries field roughly 50,000 personnel. Still far smaller than France's force structure. But here's the key difference. They would be fighting at home. And the Sahel is not Paris. It is nearly 3 million square kilometers of desert, scrubland, and fractured terrain. Minimal infrastructure, sparse roads, harsh climate, endless supply line challenges. France already learned this the hard way. Under Operation Barkhane, French forces spent nearly a decade operating in Mali, deploying thousands of troops, advanced drones, fighter jets, and full air superiority. But they didn't win the war. By 2022, they withdrew. Not because they lacked firepower, but because the mission became strategically unsustainable. The Sahel absorbs conventional power. Airstrikes cannot hold desert territory. Drones cannot stabilize political legitimacy. Elite special forces cannot secure thousands of remote villages indefinitely. If France intervened in Niger, it would not look like a conventional invasion. More likely, limited airstrikes, precision raids, targeted strikes on uranium infrastructure. Demonstrations of force meant to reassert deterrence without committing ground forces long term. Quick in, quick out. But even that carries risk because Niger anticipated this, and this is where Russia enters the equation. In April 2024, Russian military instructors arrived in Niger. Roughly 100 personnel at first, linked to what Moscow refers to as the Africa. Corps structure. They didn't arrive empty-handed. They reportedly brought equipment, training packages, and critically, air defense systems. That last detail matters more than anything else. France's greatest advantage in any confrontation is air superiority. If that edge is uncontested, Paris can strike targets rapidly, with minimal exposure. But if modern air defense systems are present, even limited ones, the calculus changes, because all it takes is one downed aircraft, one captured pilot, one burning wreckage broadcast across global media, and suddenly, what was meant to be a contained operation becomes a political crisis. By late 2025, additional Russian trainers and equipment had reportedly arrived, and Niger is not isolated in this relationship. In Mali, Russian personnel have established a presence near Bamako's airport. Satellite imagery has reportedly shown infrastructure expansion, roads, equipment movement, excavation activity. In Burkina Faso, estimates place 200 to 300 Russian-linked personnel on the ground, assisting with training and regime security. This is no longer a simple France versus Niger standoff. It is a French former colonial power facing a coordinated Sahel bloc with Russian backing. That changes the geopolitical optics. If France strikes Niger and Moscow objects at the United Nations, it no longer appears as a bilateral dispute over uranium. It begins to resemble a proxy confrontation between Paris and Moscow, and once that perception takes hold, NATO politics enter the conversation. Would Western allies support another Sahel intervention? After Afghanistan? After Mali? With public fatigue growing across Europe? President Emmanuel Macron must calculate not just military capability, but alliance politics, domestic approval, and the 2027 election clock ticking in the background. Meanwhile, Niger's leadership frames the conflict. From their perspective, this is not aggression. It is decolonization. It is economic emancipation. It is reclaiming control over uranium that fueled French reactors for half a century, while much of Niger remained without electricity. That narrative resonates regionally. Anti-French sentiment has been growing across parts of West Africa for years. The optics of a former colonial power striking a resource-rich Sahel state, especially after expelling troops, would ignite protests, not just in Niger, but potentially across neighboring capitals, and that is the strategic trap. France has overwhelming military superiority, but overwhelming power does not guarantee overwhelming control. If Paris intervenes, it risks a prolonged asymmetric confrontation in unforgiving terrain against a regional alliance under the shadow of Russian involvement during an election cycle at home. If it does nothing, it risks losing strategic uranium access, regional influence, and perceived credibility. Both paths carry cost, and that is why this crisis feels so volatile. Because when pride, power, and nuclear fuel intersect, miscalculation becomes far more dangerous than intention. And now, the final question remains. If this turns from rhetoric into reality, who actually benefits from war? If this turns into war, it will not begin with tanks crossing borders. It will begin with aircraft. The most likely scenario is not invasion, it's intervention. France would not send armored columns into the Sahel. That would be politically toxic and militarily unsustainable. Instead, Paris would likely rely on what it does best: precision power projection, Rafale fighter jets, standoff missiles, intelligence-driven strikes. Targets would be limited and strategic: uranium facilities, air defense systems, key military infrastructure. The objective wouldn't be occupation. It would be deterrence. A sharp, controlled message. Do not escalate. Further, France has overwhelming advantages. Roughly 260,000 active personnel, a defense budget exceeding $50 billion, nuclear submarines, an aircraft carrier battle group, advanced ISR capabilities. Niger has around 10,000 troops, fewer than 30 aircraft, no navy, limited radar coverage, aging equipment. On paper, French air power could cripple Niger's conventional military capacity in days. But here's where things become unpredictable, because Niger has prepared for that scenario. Russian-linked trainers have reportedly assisted in strengthening local air defense capabilities. Even limited systems can complicate French operations. Air campaigns depend on confidence. Confidence that aircraft can strike without unacceptable loss. If a French jet is shot down over Niamey, if a pilot is captured, if images flood social media across Africa, the operation instantly shifts from limited strike to political crisis. And crises escalate. At that moment, the alliance of Sahel states becomes active. Burkina Faso mobilizes forces along its borders. Even if they cannot challenge France conventionally, they can stretch the theater, increase uncertainty, raise costs. And wars are often decided not by firepower, but by cost tolerance. Now consider the second scenario. France chooses restraint. No strikes, no aircraft, no immediate retaliation. Instead, Paris leans into economic warfare, legal action through international courts, sanctions, asset freezes, diplomatic isolation through European and NATO partners. This would be slower, but safer. However, it carries its own risks, because if Niger successfully sells the uranium stockpile, estimated at roughly $270 million, to alternative buyers, that signals something profound. It signals that France no longer controls strategic supply chains in a region it once dominated. It signals declining influence. There is also the third scenario, the most dangerous one, a convoy mistaken for military reinforcement, an air defense radar misreading a surveillance flight, a border clash spiraling faster than diplomats can respond. Modern conflicts often ignite not through deliberate declaration, but through miscalculation, especially in politically charged environments. And this crisis is politically charged on both sides. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron faces a 2027 election. Appearing weak on national energy security or strategic credibility could be weaponized by opponents. In Niamey, General Abdourahmane Tiani has built his legitimacy around sovereignty and resistance to foreign control. Backing down publicly would undermine that narrative. Both leaders are constrained. Both must project strength. That is what makes this dangerous. But here is the cold strategic truth. A full-scale conventional war between France and Niger the imbalance is too extreme. The costs too unpredictable. The geopolitical fallout too severe, especially with Russia hovering in the background. What we are witnessing is not the opening of World War III. It is a power recalibration. Niger is asserting control over uranium that fueled French reactors for half a century. France is weighing how far it is willing to go to protect its strategic interests. This is a test of sovereignty, of influence, of post-colonial power dynamics in the 21st century. And sometimes the loudest declarations, "We are going to war," are not literal battle plans. They are strategic signals. Signals meant to deter, to negotiate from strength, to shift leverage. The real battlefield may never see bombs falling. It may be fought in arbitration chambers, in diplomatic corridors, in energy contracts signed quietly with new partners. But make no mistake, when nuclear fuel, national pride, Russian backing, and French credibility collide in one volatile region, the margin for error becomes razor thin. And in geopolitics, razor-thin margins are where history changes.